Bailey Holloway had always believed her life was settled. The years with Marcus had passed in a steady rhythm, predictable and secure. They had built a home in a quiet suburb of Atlanta, a two-story house with a manicured lawn and a porch swing where they used to sit in the evenings, sipping sweet tea. Their children had grown and moved away, one to college in Chicago, the other starting a new life in Houston. It was supposed to be the season of quiet contentment, a time for rediscovering herself, perhaps even rekindling the passion that had dulled over the years. Her days followed a structured routine, mornings at the law office where she worked as a paralegal, afternoons spent at the gym or catching up with friends, evenings filled with dinner preparations and quiet conversations with Marcus. There had been nothing in their life that foreshadowed what she would uncover that night. Nothing that could have prepared her. The unexpected change of plans came suddenly. A work trip to Washington was canceled at the last minute, and rather than staying overnight in a hotel, she took the next flight back home. It was late when she landed at Hartsfield-Jackson, fatigue settling deep into her bones after a long day. She barely had the energy to call a cab, and as she rode through the city streets, she imagined sliding into bed next to Marcus, feeling the familiar warmth of his body beside her. When she arrived home, something felt off the moment she stepped through the front door. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a sensation, a weight in the air that didn't belong. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but unnatural, like the world had paused for something unspeakable. The scent of Marcus's cologne lingered in the air, stronger than usual, mixing with another, unfamiliar fragrance. She set her bag down by the door, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. A distant sound reached her ears, a muffled voice, then another. She held her breath. It was coming from upstairs. Bailey took a slow step forward, then another. The wooden floor creaked beneath her weight, but the noises from the bedroom didn't stop. If anything, they deepened, turned into something more intimate, more raw. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the banister, each step up the staircase feeling heavier than the last. As she approached the bedroom door, she hesitated. Her rational mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps the television had been left on, or Marcus was on the phone with someone. But the longer she listened, the more undeniable the reality became. She pushed the door open. The world fractured in an instant. Marcus. Her husband. The man she had built her life with, shared secrets with, loved for decades. And beside him, Jerome, his father. They had frozen mid-movement, their bodies tangled in a way that should have never been. The look of horror on their faces mirrored the one she felt twisting her own. Bailey's breath caught in her throat, her chest locking up as if she had been punched. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in around her, suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, cologne, and something far worse, betrayal. She tried to form words, but nothing came out. Her lips parted, but the scream she expected never arrived. Her heart pounded, her pulse roaring in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to run, to do something, but her body refused to obey. Marcus pulled away first, scrambling for the sheets, but there was no way to erase what had already been seen. Jerome's face, a mixture of shame and terror, turned toward her, his mouth opening as if to explain. There was no explanation. There could be none. The betrayal sliced through her, deeper than any wound she had ever imagined. This wasn't an affair. It wasn't some drunken mistake or a fleeting moment of weakness. This was something else entirely, something grotesque in its secrecy, something that made her question every moment of her life. Had she ever really known Marcus? Had her entire marriage been a lie? Her vision blurred. Her legs trembled beneath her, and she grasped the doorframe to steady herself. She had thought she understood what betrayal was. She had been wrong. This was something worse. The walls of their home, once a sanctuary, now felt foreign, tainted. The bed where they had lain together, whispered dreams and fears, was now a crime scene. A strangled breath escaped her lips, the only sound she could muster. The men before her, men she had trusted, men she had loved in different ways, were now strangers. Jerome lowered his head, as if in silent prayer. Marcus looked at her, pleading without words, his face contorted with something she refused to call regret. Bailey turned on her heel. She didn't remember descending the stairs. She didn't remember grabbing her purse or slamming the door behind her. All she knew was that she needed to get away. Away from the house, from the reality that had shattered her existence. Away from the memories that had just been rewritten into something monstrous. The night swallowed her whole as she stepped into the cold air, but the numbness inside her was worse. She climbed into her car, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. She had always thought she knew what love was. What trust meant. What marriage was built on. But that night, she learned the truth. Everything she had believed was a lie. Bailey did not remember getting into her car. One moment, she had been standing in the doorway of the bedroom, her world crumbling around her, and the next, she was gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The city lights blurred past her, neon smearing against the windshield, but she didn't see any of it. The streets of Atlanta stretched endlessly before her, winding through the quiet, late-night emptiness, but she could not recall making a single turn. It was as if she had been on autopilot, her body moving while her mind spiraled into the abyss. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but no tears fell. The weight in her chest was suffocating, pressing against her ribs like a steel vise, making it hard to breathe. Her stomach churned, nausea rising in waves as she replayed the moment over and over again. The sheets tangled around their limbs. The shock in their eyes. The muffled sounds of pleasure that had still lingered in the air as she stood frozen in the doorway. It had been real. It had been happening. She clenched her teeth, biting down so hard that a dull ache spread through her jaw. She wanted to scream, to break something, to claw at her own skin and rip away the filth of what she had seen. But she remained silent, her foot pressing harder against the gas pedal, the speedometer climbing higher and higher. The betrayal itself was unbearable, but the nature of it was something else entirely. An affair would have been one thing. She had never even allowed herself to entertain the thought that Marcus might cheat on her, but if it had been with another woman, it would have been understandable in some twisted way. Painful, yes. Devastating. But this was something she could not comprehend. This was beyond infidelity. This was monstrous. Her husband. The man she had loved, had built a life with, had raised children with. And his father. His own flesh and blood. A shudder racked her body. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her nails dug into her palms, leaving crescent-shaped indentations in her skin. The air in the car felt thick, suffocating, and she rolled down the window, hoping the rush of wind against her face would snap her out of whatever trance she had fallen into. It didn't. The numbness remained, a cold, creeping sensation that spread from her core to the tips of her fingers. Somewhere along the way, she ended up by the river. The Chattahoochee stretched out before her, dark and endless, the water reflecting the flickering glow of the city skyline in the distance. She pulled the car over to the side of the empty road and shut off the engine. The sudden silence pressed in on her ears, amplifying the deafening roar inside her own head. She stepped out of the car, her legs unsteady, her body trembling. The night air was damp, clinging to her skin, but she barely felt it. The stillness of the river mirrored the stillness inside her. A part of her wanted to wade into the water, to let it swallow her whole, to disappear beneath the surface where everything was quiet, where she didn't have to think, didn't have to feel. But she didn't move. Instead, she stood there, staring out at the water, fists clenched at her sides. The rage was building now, curling through her veins like fire, burning away the numbness. It coiled in her stomach, spreading outward, rising to her throat until she could almost taste it. The taste of betrayal. Of disgust. Her mind reeled with questions, each one more unbearable than the last. How long had this been happening? Had it been years? Decades? Had she been blind for their entire marriage? Had she been nothing more than a convenient mask, a cover for something that should never have existed? A wave of nausea rolled through her, and she bent forward, heaving into the grass beside the road. When her stomach was empty, she wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling hand and straightened. The rage did not subside. It only intensified. She got back into the car and drove. By the time she returned home, the house was dark. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the driveway. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. This wasn't her home anymore. It was a crime scene. A monument to a life that had been nothing but a carefully constructed lie. She entered the house quietly, her movements slow, deliberate. The silence inside was deafening, pressing in around her like a physical weight. The smell of Marcus's cologne still lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of what she had walked in on just hours ago. She made her way to the bedroom. Marcus was asleep. Lying on his side, breathing evenly, as if nothing had happened. As if everything was normal. A slow, burning fury crept up her spine. How could he sleep? How could he lie there, peaceful and content, when he had just shattered their world? Her gaze drifted toward his nightstand. His phone rested on top, screen dark. She reached for it, her fingers hovering just above the surface before pulling away. She didn't need to look. She already knew the truth. She turned away from him, from the bed they had shared for years, and walked into the bathroom. The light was too harsh, the reflection in the mirror unfamiliar. The woman staring back at her looked hollow, drained. Her eyes, once warm and filled with life, were now vacant, dark pools of nothingness. She sat down on the edge of the bathtub, hands clasped together, her mind spiraling. Divorce. Scandal. Exposure. Or something more. The thought came unbidden, slipping into her consciousness like a whisper in the dark. Something more. She sat there for a long time, staring at the tiled floor, listening to the quiet rhythm of Marcus's breathing from the other room. She had always believed she knew who she was. That she knew what she was capable of. Tonight, she realized she had been wrong. Marcus awoke to the feeling of something heavy in the air. It wasn't tangible, not something he could name outright, but it was there, a thick, suffocating weight pressing against his chest. When he turned in bed, expecting to see Bailey still asleep beside him, he found only an empty space. The sheets on her side were cool, untouched. He pushed himself upright, rubbing a hand over his face as his eyes adjusted to the dim morning light filtering through the blinds. He listened. The house was quiet, but not the usual kind of morning quiet. There were no sounds of Bailey moving around in the kitchen, no clatter of dishes or the faint hum of the coffee machine. The silence unsettled him. When he stepped into the hallway, he found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular. Her posture was rigid, her fingers loosely wrapped around a half-filled glass of water. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, flickered to him for the briefest moment before looking away again. The weight in his chest grew heavier. He knew she had seen. He opened his mouth, searching for words, but none came. He didn't know where to begin. He could explain, he could tell her how it wasn't what she thought, how it was complicated, how. But her silence was louder than any accusation she could have thrown at him. It settled between them like a physical wall, impenetrable and absolute. Bailey didn't cry. She didn't yell. She didn't demand answers. She simply existed in that silence, and it was worse than any confrontation he had imagined. He lingered in the doorway for a long moment before turning away, the weight of her eyes following him as he moved through the house, going through the motions of a morning that felt like it belonged to another life. By the time he left for work, she still hadn't spoken a word. Hours passed. The day dragged in slow, unbearable increments. Bailey stayed home. She had no desire to be anywhere else, to see anyone, to hear the mindless conversations of strangers. The walls of their house felt foreign, like she had stepped into someone else's existence and was pretending to belong. She wandered through the rooms, touching the furniture, tracing her fingers along the kitchen counter where Marcus used to stand on Sunday mornings, making pancakes. The memories felt distant now, like faded photographs buried in an attic, covered in dust and neglect. At some point, she found herself in front of the liquor cabinet. Marcus kept a bottle of expensive whiskey there, a gift from a client that he had been saving for a special occasion. Bailey reached for it, running her fingers over the smooth glass before pulling it free. She poured herself a drink. The amber liquid swirled in the glass, catching the light. She took a sip. The warmth burned down her throat, settling in her stomach, but it didn't bring her comfort. She poured another. And another. The alcohol dulled the edges of her mind, but didn't erase the images burned into her memory. Nothing could. By the time night fell, the house was dark except for a single lamp in the corner of the living room, casting long, uneven shadows across the walls. The whiskey bottle sat half empty on the table. Bailey stood near the window, watching the empty street outside. Waiting. Marcus was late. She had checked his location once, tracking his phone like she had done countless times before, and found him at an unfamiliar address. A hotel, a bar, maybe an apartment. She didn't know. She didn't care. The hours stretched on. Finally, headlights cut through the darkness, crawling up the driveway. The car came to a stop. The engine shut off. Bailey remained still as the front door opened. Marcus stepped inside, pausing in the entryway when he saw her. The air between them was thick, charged with something unspoken, something dangerous. He took a slow step forward. Then another. She didn't move. The whiskey had settled into her bloodstream, numbing the sharpest edges of her emotions, but leaving something else behind, something dark, something resolute. Marcus must have sensed it. His steps faltered. His lips parted, as if he was about to say something, to offer some kind of explanation. Bailey's hand tightened around the cold metal she had been holding. The gun felt heavier than she expected, solid and unyielding in her grasp. Marcus saw it at the same moment she raised it. A flicker of something crossed his face: fear, disbelief, regret. His hands lifted slightly, palms out, a silent plea. Bailey's heartbeat was slow, steady. Her finger curled around the trigger. The gunshot was muffled in the quiet house, a dull, echoing crack that shattered the stillness. Marcus staggered back, his body jerking from the impact before his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the floor, a strangled sound escaping his lips as his hands clutched at his chest. Bailey exhaled, the breath leaving her lungs in a slow, controlled stream. The silence returned. This time, it was absolute. Bailey stood over Marcus's body, staring down at the dark red stain spreading across the pale carpet. The contrast was stark, almost surreal. The deep crimson of his blood seeped outward in slow, widening tendrils, consuming the fibers beneath him. The room smelled of whiskey, sweat, and something metallic, thicker, heavier. The scent of death. She did not move. Her ears rang from the gunshot, but beneath the high-pitched whine, she could still hear the faint, gurgling sound coming from his throat. His body twitched slightly, his fingers weakly grasping at nothing. A faint, wet breath rattled through his lips. His eyes were still open, wide and glossy with shock, locked onto hers. He wasn't dead. Not yet. Bailey felt nothing. No triumph, no sorrow, no guilt. The emotions that had driven her moments ago had dissipated, leaving only silence in their place. It was as if something within her had been turned off, a switch flipped, a light extinguished. The house around her remained eerily still. The clock on the wall continued to tick, its rhythmic beat far too calm for the chaos that had just unfolded. The lamp in the corner flickered, casting unsteady shadows across the room. The whiskey bottle on the table reflected the dim glow, the liquid inside now meaningless. A part of her recognized the distant sound of sirens, growing closer, their wails cutting through the stillness of the night. Someone had called them. Maybe a neighbor had heard the gunshot. Maybe she had called herself. She couldn't remember. It didn't matter. She stood motionless as the seconds stretched into eternity. The sirens grew louder, the red and blue lights flashing through the curtains, painting the walls in fractured colors. The front door burst open. Heavy boots pounded against the wooden floor. Voices filled the space, barking orders, tense and urgent. Bailey did not flinch. The officers swarmed the room, weapons raised, eyes scanning for threats. Someone shouted at her, demanding she put her hands up. She complied, her movements slow, deliberate. The gun slipped from her grip, hitting the floor with a dull clatter. Rough hands grabbed her, twisting her arms behind her back. The cold steel of handcuffs bit into her wrists, locking into place with a sharp click. The touch was impersonal, mechanical. She felt nothing. More voices, more movement. An officer knelt beside Marcus, checking for a pulse. The radio crackled, relaying information, requesting medical assistance. Bailey watched without reacting. The world moved around her, detached and distant. A voice, close to her ear, asked her something. She didn't respond. Another voice, this one higher, more frantic, rose in the background. A woman's voice. Crying. Someone was screaming. It wasn't her. The walls of the house seemed to shift, the room shrinking, warping, distorting. The blood on the carpet was still spreading, inching closer to her feet. She was led toward the door, her steps steady but without purpose. The weight of the handcuffs pressed into her skin, grounding her in the moment, yet she felt as if she were floating, adrift in a sea of white noise. Flashing lights filled the night outside, reflecting off the windows. The neighbors had gathered in clusters along the sidewalk, their faces a mix of shock, curiosity, and fear. Some whispered to one another. Others simply watched, their gazes heavy with unspoken questions. Bailey's gaze remained unfocused as she was guided down the porch steps. The air outside was cool, but she didn't feel it. A figure moved past her, rushing toward the house. A paramedic. Another followed, carrying medical equipment. She knew they would try to save Marcus. She knew it wouldn't matter. She was placed in the back of a police car. The door shut behind her with a hollow thud. The sirens continued their relentless wailing. The radio inside the car buzzed with voices, relaying codes and instructions, but she didn't listen. Her hands rested in her lap, still bound. The skin around her wrists was already reddening from the pressure. She stared down at them, studying the thin indentations forming against her dark skin. She had known this was coming. The moment she pulled the trigger, the moment the bullet met flesh, she had known. There had never been another ending. The car remained still for several minutes as officers moved in and out of the house, securing the scene, gathering evidence, documenting the wreckage of the night. Bailey did not look up when the driver's side door opened and an officer slid in. She didn't react when the engine started, when the vehicle pulled away from the curb. She sat in silence, watching the city blur past through the tinted window, the neon lights of Atlanta turning into shapeless streaks against the glass. The weight of what had happened should have crushed her. The enormity of her actions should have swallowed her whole. But Bailey Holloway no longer existed. Only the echo of what she had been remained, drifting through the dark waters of what was left behind. The trial of Bailey Holloway became a national sensation. The moment her name was released to the press, the media latched onto the story with insatiable hunger. A respected black woman from a well-regarded Atlanta family, a paralegal with no prior criminal record, had shot her husband in cold blood. The details surrounding the case, the shocking discovery, the family's hidden secrets, the brutal end, fueled endless speculation. News outlets ran the story in an endless cycle. Talk shows dissected every angle. Some painted Bailey as a scorned woman, a victim pushed beyond reason, a wife betrayed in the worst possible way. Others saw her as a violent criminal, a murderer who had taken justice into her own hands rather than walking away. For weeks, the headlines screamed. Betrayal, murder, scandal. Newspaper covers carried images of her being escorted from the courtroom, her wrists bound in cuffs, her face devoid of emotion. Her mugshot became infamous, her dark, hollow eyes staring directly into the camera, neither pleading nor defiant. Pundits debated whether she had snapped in a crime of passion or had acted with premeditation. The prosecution sought to prove the latter. They presented their case methodically, detailing how Bailey had waited in the dark, how she had armed herself, how she had pulled the trigger without hesitation. They painted her as a woman who had allowed fury to consume her, who had become a cold-blooded executioner rather than a wife seeking justice through the law. The defense pushed back, arguing that she had been emotionally and psychologically shattered by what she had witnessed. They called expert witnesses, psychologists who testified about trauma, about the brain's response to extreme betrayal, about the way rational thought could be overtaken by the primal need to reclaim control. The trial was long. She sat through it all in silence. Her children were there in the courtroom, seated behind the railing, their faces pale, their expressions unreadable. They did not approach her. They did not look at her for too long. They sat stiffly beside her sister, who refused to meet her gaze. Friends had disappeared. Neighbors, once warm and familiar, now avoided the courtroom's hallways. Bailey had never felt so alone. Every morning, she was led into the courtroom in a beige prison jumpsuit, shackles around her wrists and ankles. She did not flinch when cameras flashed. She did not react when reporters whispered as she passed. She listened as the prosecution tore apart the pieces of her life. Her marriage was scrutinized. Her emotions dissected. Her choices laid bare. The jury watched her closely, as if waiting for her to break, to show something: remorse, anger, desperation. But Bailey Holloway did not break. She simply sat, listening to the story of her own destruction unfold in voices that were not hers. The closing arguments came. The prosecutor stood before the jury, speaking of justice, of right and wrong, of choices that could never be undone. He told them that no matter the betrayal, no matter the pain, the law did not permit revenge. That a life had been taken, and that for it, Bailey Holloway must pay. Her defense attorney countered, painting her as a woman who had lost everything in a single moment of unimaginable horror. A woman who had lived by the rules until the moment those rules shattered beneath her feet. Then, the deliberation. 2 days passed. The city held its breath, waiting for the verdict. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces grim, Bailey did not look at them. She kept her gaze forward, hands folded in her lap, waiting for what she had known all along. The judge asked for the verdict. Guilty. The word did not shake her. She barely heard the rest of it, the formal sentencing, the legal jargon, the rustling of papers. It all blended together, a hum of inevitability. The sentence was announced. 20 years. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Someone cried out. Someone else muttered angrily. The prosecutor looked satisfied. Her defense attorney looked drained. Bailey did not react. She did not weep. She did not plead. The bailiffs moved toward her, preparing to lead her away. She stood before they reached her, turned without a word, and walked out of the courtroom. She did not look back. The doors closed behind her, and with them, the life she had once known ceased to exist. Bailey Holloway stepped through the gates of the penitentiary, a small canvas bag clutched in her hand. The air outside felt foreign, too open, too vast after a decade behind concrete walls and metal bars. She hesitated on the threshold, blinking against the glare of the late afternoon sun, her body instinctively tensing at the unfamiliar sensation of freedom. 10 years. 10 years inside a cage where time had moved at a different pace, where the world outside had shrunk to nothing but memory. Now, standing here, she felt weightless, untethered, like a ghost slipping through the cracks of a life that had long since moved on without her. The bus stop was down the road, a rusted sign leaning to one side, a bench with peeling paint sitting beneath it. The few bills she had been given upon her release barely amounted to anything, but it was enough for a one-way fare. To where, she did not know. Her footsteps felt heavy as she crossed the cracked pavement, the sounds of the city whispering at the edges of her awareness. A car horn blared somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and laughter floated from a nearby park where children played. It all seemed unreal, like echoes from another lifetime. She reached the bus stop and sat down, setting her bag beside her. The weight of it was insignificant, just a few pieces of clothing donated by a prison outreach program, a Bible, a worn notebook she had filled with thoughts over the years. She had nothing else. There had been no one waiting for her when she was processed out. No family, no friends, no familiar faces. She had known there wouldn't be. Marcus was dead. She had learned of it 3 years into her sentence. It had come in the form of a short, impersonal letter from a distant relative, someone who had felt obligated to inform her but not to offer condolences. He had died from complications after surgery, alone. She had felt nothing when she read the words. Jerome had disappeared. No one knew where he had gone, or if they did, they hadn't bothered to tell her. Perhaps he had left the city. Perhaps he had started over somewhere far away where no one knew his secrets. It didn't matter. He was as much a ghost to her now as she was to the world. Her children had grown up without her. She had seen their faces only a handful of times in the first years after her conviction. They had visited at first, hesitant and wary, their emotions tangled in grief and confusion. But as the years passed, the visits stopped. Letters became fewer until they ceased altogether. Bailey didn't blame them. She had stolen something from them, something that could never be replaced. A gust of wind rustled the leaves on the sidewalk, sending them skittering across the ground. The sky was darkening, streaked with the dying embers of the setting sun. She had spent so long in darkness, she wondered if she would ever learn to live in the light again. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes, the doors creaking open. Bailey hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The driver didn't look at her twice, didn't recognize her face, didn't care about the past she carried like a weight on her back. She dropped the fare into the slot and moved toward an empty seat near the back, pressing her forehead against the cool glass of the window as the city passed by in blurred shapes and colors. The ride was long. She didn't know where she was going. She had no destination, no plan, only the knowledge that she could not stay still. She got off somewhere on the outskirts of Atlanta, where the streets were quieter, where she could breathe without feeling like the past was pressing in on her from all sides. She found a cheap motel with flickering neon lights and a vacancy sign that buzzed with electricity. The man behind the counter barely glanced at her as he slid a key across the counter, exchanging it for the last of the cash she had. The room was small, the bed stiff, the air thick with the scent of bleach and old smoke. She sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the peeling wallpaper, at the television remote that sat untouched on the nightstand. The silence stretched. She was free. But freedom felt like an abyss, endless and empty. She lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioning unit in the corner. She had nothing. No home. No family. No past she wanted to reclaim. And yet, she was still breathing. She closed her eyes and let out a slow, measured breath. If she was still breathing, it meant she could start again. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But one day. She had no choice but to try.